HOA built their tennis courts over my land. My cousin, the land registry director, crushed them. Before we start the story, please comment down from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. My wife Susan and I had been looking forward to our 2-week vacation in Europe for months. Our daughter had moved to Paris last year, and this was our first chance to visit her new apartment and explore the city together. The trip was everything we had hoped for: beautiful sights, amazing food, and precious time with our daughter. But our perfect vacation turned into a nightmare the moment we returned home. As our taxi pulled into our driveway after the long flight, something seemed wrong with the view from our house. Where there should have been a rolling meadow at the edge of our property, a beautiful 1-acre plot where wildflowers grew and deer often grazed in the early morning, there were now 2 perfectly manicured tennis courts, complete with tall fencing, bright lights, and a small clubhouse. "Driver, wait here a minute," I said, confused. "I think we might be at the wrong house." "This is 1487 Oak Ridge Road, right?" the driver confirmed, looking at his GPS. "Yes, but..." I trailed off, still trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Susan grabbed my arm. "James, look. Those tennis courts, they're on our property." We paid the driver and asked him to leave our luggage by the door while we walked down to investigate. With every step closer to the tennis courts, my confusion turned to anger. This was definitely our land. The large oak tree where we had once hung a swing for our children still stood near the edge of the property, though now it was surrounded by chain-link fencing. "How is this possible?" Susan whispered. "We were only gone for 2 weeks. The tennis courts were immaculate, freshly painted green surfaces with crisp white lines, professional-grade nets, and even windscreens along the fences bearing the logo Oakwood Estates Tennis Club. A small but elegant clubhouse stood at one end with a covered patio area and several benches. As we stood there in shock, a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair walked confidently toward us from the direction of the neighboring subdivision. She wore an expensive tennis outfit and carried a clipboard, looking like she owned the place. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice crisp and businesslike. "This is a private facility for Oakwood Estates residents only. You'll need to leave immediately." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Leave? This is MY property. You've built these courts on MY land." The woman looked annoyed, as if I was being deliberately difficult. "Sir, this amenity area is part of Oakwood Estates. It was approved by the HOA board and properly permitted by the county. If you're not a resident, you need to leave." "I'm James Peterson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my growing anger. "I own this property. All the way from my house over there to that line of oak trees. These tennis courts are sitting on my property." The woman's expression didn't change. "I'm Margaret Wilson, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. According to our plans and surveys, this land is part of our development's common area. It always has been." "That's impossible," I replied. "I've owned this 5-acre parcel for 23 years. I have the deed and property maps to prove it." Margaret sighed as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Mr. Peterson, is it? Our development has invested over $200,000 in these tennis facilities. The plans were approved months ago. If there's some misunderstanding about property lines, I suggest you take it up with the county. But for now, this is HOA property and you're trespassing." I couldn't believe her arrogance. "I'm trespassing? You built on MY land without permission and I'm the trespasser?" "James," Susan murmured, placing a calming hand on my arm. "Let's get the property documents and sort this out properly." Margaret checked her watch impatiently. "I have a board meeting to attend. If you have concerns, you can file them in writing to the HOA office. But these courts are opening for residents tomorrow, and that schedule won't change." With that, she turned and walked away, clipboard clutched firmly to her chest. Back in our house, still surrounded by unpacked luggage, I dug through our filing cabinet and found the property deed, survey maps, and tax records. Everything confirmed what I already knew: that meadow was part of our land. It had been since we purchased the house in 1998. "I don't understand how this could happen," Susan said, looking over the documents. "Wouldn't they need permits? Wouldn't someone check the property lines?" "You'd think so," I replied, growing more upset as I thought about it. But Margaret seemed awfully confident. "Something's not right here." I called the county building department immediately, but got sent to voicemail. It was Friday afternoon and they were apparently closed already. This would have to wait until Monday. That evening, we walked back down to the tennis courts to take photos for evidence. To our surprise, there were already people playing on them, residents from Oakwood Estates breaking in the new facilities before the official opening. One of the players, a middle-aged man I recognized as living in the subdivision, approached the fence when he saw us taking pictures. "Beautiful courts, aren't they?" he said proudly. "A lot better use of this space than just empty field." "This empty field is part of my property," I replied. "The HOA built these courts illegally." The man looked confused. "That can't be right. They've been planning this for over a year. There were meetings, votes, permits, everything." "Well, they never asked me," I said firmly. "And I never sold this land to anyone." The man seemed genuinely perplexed. "You should talk to Margaret. She handled everything. Said it was all perfectly legal." Over the weekend, more residents came to use the courts. Each time Susan or I approached, we were treated like trespassers or troublemakers. One woman even threatened to call security if we didn't leave HOA property. By Monday morning I was furious. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and drove straight to the county building department when they opened at 8 a.m. I brought all my property documents with me, determined to get answers. The clerk at the front desk, a young man named Tyler according to his nameplate, seemed overwhelmed when I explained the situation. "Sir, you're saying someone built tennis courts on your land without permission?" he asked, looking doubtful. "Yes, the Oakwood Estates HOA. While we were on vacation. I need to know how they got permits for that." Tyler typed something into his computer. "Let me check. Oakwood Estates, tennis courts. Here it is. Permit was issued last month for recreational facilities on HOA common area, Lot 37 of Oakwood Estates." "But that's not their common area," I insisted, spreading out my property map on the counter. "That's my land. Look, here's my deed showing 5 acres, and here's the survey map clearly showing the boundaries." Tyler compared the documents, looking increasingly confused. "This is strange. According to our records, that parcel is part of Oakwood Estates. But your documents show it's your property." He looked up at me apologetically. "I'm not sure what to tell you. This might be above my pay grade." "Then I need to speak with someone higher up," I insisted. "This is theft of my property." "Let me get my supervisor," Tyler said, disappearing into a back office. A few minutes later, a middle-aged woman with a severe haircut and an ID badge reading Helen Morris, permit supervisor, approached. "Mr. Peterson? I understand there's an issue with some tennis courts." I explained the situation again, showing her my property documents and the conflicting county records. Helen frowned as she reviewed everything. "This is concerning. According to our system, the HOA submitted documentation showing they owned that land as part of their common area. They included a survey and what appeared to be proper ownership records." "Well, those records are wrong," I said firmly. "I've owned that land for 23 years and never sold it to anyone." Helen nodded thoughtfully. "Let me make a copy of your documents. This will need to be investigated. It's possible there was a clerical error somewhere, or something more concerning." "More concerning? Like what?" Helen chose her words carefully. "Let's not jump to conclusions yet. But if someone deliberately falsified property records to obtain permits, that would be fraud." As I left the building department, I felt a mix of validation and frustration. They acknowledged something was wrong, but had given no timeline for resolution or any immediate action to stop people from using the illegally built courts. On my way home, I called my cousin Michael. Growing up, we had been close, but our lives had taken different paths. He had gone into government work while I became an engineer. We still got together for family events, but hadn't spoken in a few months. What most people in my neighborhood didn't know was that Michael Peterson was now the director of the county land registry office. If anyone could help me navigate this mess and get fast answers, it would be Michael. "Tennis courts?" he said, sounding shocked after I explained the situation. "On your property? Without permission? That's not just a boundary dispute, James. That's criminal." "That's what I thought," I replied, relieved someone finally understood the seriousness. "But the HOA president acts like I'm the one causing problems." "Of course she does," Michael said grimly. "Because if what you're saying is accurate, she's in serious trouble. Have you checked your property stakes? The markers should still be there." "I hadn't thought of that. I'll do that as soon as I get home." "What should I do next?" "Don't confront the HOA again yet," Michael advised. "Let me look into this officially. Something's very wrong if they got permits to build on your land. I'll call you back within a few hours." When I got home, I grabbed our old metal detector from the garage and went to check the property markers. Years ago, when we first bought the place, I had located all the survey stakes and noted their positions. The metal detector should help find them if they were still there. At the edge of what used to be our meadow, I slowly swept the device back and forth. Where there should have been a metal stake marking our property line, there was nothing. I checked all four corners where our meadow used to be. All markers were missing. Just as I was finishing, Margaret Wilson drove up in her luxury SUV and stepped out, looking annoyed. "Mr. Peterson, several residents have complained about you loitering around our tennis facility. I must insist that you leave HOA property immediately." I stood my ground. "The property markers that were here for decades are now missing. Would you happen to know anything about that, Ms. Wilson?" She brushed an imaginary piece of lint from her designer blazer. "The construction company did a complete survey before building. If old markers were removed, I'm sure it was because they were inaccurate or obsolete." "Removing survey markers is illegal," I informed her. "Just like building on someone else's property." Margaret's perfect composure slipped for just a moment, showing a flash of worry before she recovered. "Mr. Peterson, Oakwood Estates followed every proper procedure. We have all the documentation proving this land belongs to the HOA. Your claims are both unfounded and frankly beginning to border on harassment." "We'll see about that," I replied calmly. "The county is investigating as we speak." "The county approved our permits," she shot back. "They've already reviewed and verified our property claims. This matter is closed." She turned back toward her vehicle. "And if you continue to disturb our residents, we'll be forced to take legal action." As she drove away, my phone rang. It was Michael. "James, can you come to my office right away? I found something you need to see." 30 minutes later, I was sitting in Michael's office at the County Administration Building. His title, Director, Land Registry Office, was prominently displayed on the door. His expression was grave as he spread several documents across his desk. "Someone filed paperwork last year transferring a 1-acre portion of your land to Oakwood Estates HOA, he explained, pointing to an official-looking document. "According to this, you sold it to them for $75,000. That's ridiculous. I never sold anything." Michael nodded grimly. "I know. Look at the signature." I examined the document closely. There was indeed a signature on the seller's line that vaguely resembled mine. But it wasn't mine. "This is forgery," I said, anger building in my chest. "I never signed this. I never received $75,000. This is completely fabricated." "Exactly," Michael agreed. "And it gets worse. They filed this new survey afterward, which conveniently redraws your property line to exclude that 1-acre meadow." He showed me another document with official stamps and signatures. "This is what they used to get the building permits." "How is this possible?" I asked, stunned by the brazenness of it all. "Don't you have protections against this kind of fraud?" Michael looked genuinely troubled. "We should. But someone in this office processed this paperwork without proper verification. The deed transfer should have required notarization, ID verification, and more. Someone either made a series of massive mistakes or—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Or was paid to look the other way," I concluded. "I've already initiated an internal investigation," Michael assured me. "But more importantly, I flagged these documents as potentially fraudulent and put a freeze on that property section. No more work can be done there until this is resolved." "What about the tennis courts that are already built? People are already using them." "That's more complicated," Michael admitted. "Legally, since they built on your property without permission, those structures belong to you now. But getting them removed or getting compensation will likely require court action." I left Michael's office feeling vindicated but still frustrated. The wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, but at least they were turning. Michael promised to fast-track the investigation on his end, but warned it could still take time to unravel everything. When I returned home, Susan was waiting anxiously for news. "It's fraud," I told her simply. "They forged my signature on a fake land sale and redrew our property lines." Susan gasped. "That's not just wrong, that's criminal. Who would do such a thing?" "My guess is Margaret Wilson played a major role," I replied. "But I doubt she acted alone." That evening, as we discussed our options, there was a knock at our door. It was a man in his mid-60s with a troubled expression. He introduced himself as Frank Thompson, a member of the Oakwood Estates HOA board. "Mr. Peterson, I've just come from an emergency board meeting. There are concerning allegations about our tennis courts project." He seemed genuinely disturbed. "Margaret Wilson assured us all paperwork was in order, but now there's talk of fraudulent documents. I wanted to hear your side directly." I invited him in and showed him my property records, explaining everything I'd learned from Michael. Frank's face grew increasingly pale. "Good Lord," he muttered. The board never saw any of the actual property transfers. Margaret handled everything through her husband's law firm. We were just shown the final permits and approvals. Her husband is a lawyer? This new information was significant. Frank nodded. Richard Wilson. He has a practice downtown. He handled all the legal aspects of the project. He looked around nervously. I shouldn't be here, but several board members are worried we might be implicated in something illegal. We approved the tennis courts based on what Margaret told us. After Frank left, promising to share anything else he discovered, Susan and I had a new perspective on what we were dealing with. This wasn't just an aggressive HOA president. This was potentially a conspiracy involving a lawyer who should have known better. The next morning, I called Michael to share this new information about Richard Wilson's involvement. He was very interested. That explains a lot, Michael said. A lawyer would know exactly what paperwork to falsify and how to make it look legitimate. I'm meeting with the county prosecutor this afternoon. With your permission, I'd like to bring all of this to their attention. Absolutely, I agreed. This goes beyond just taking my land. Later that day, as I was working in our garden, trying to distract myself from the tennis court situation, a black SUV with county government plates pulled up. Michael stepped out, along with a woman carrying a briefcase. James, this is Sophia Martinez from the district attorney's office. Michael introduced us. She'd like to ask you some questions about the property transfer and see your meadow, or what's left of it. For the next hour, I walked Sophia through everything that had happened, showing her the tennis courts, our property documents, and the forged signature on the paperwork Michael had brought. She took photographs and detailed notes. Based on what I'm seeing, there are multiple potential felonies here, Sophia explained. Forgery, fraud, falsifying government documents, and grand theft of real property just to start. This isn't a civil matter anymore, it's criminal. What happens next? I asked. I'll be presenting this to the DA for approval to open a formal investigation, she replied. In the meantime, try to avoid direct confrontation with the Wilsons or the HOA. Let the legal process work. That advice proved difficult to follow. The very next day, a large sign appeared at the entrance to the tennis courts. Grand opening celebration, Saturday 10 a.m. free tennis lessons, refreshments, ribbon cutting with Mayor Anders. They were planning a big public ceremony to open a facility built on stolen land. The audacity was breathtaking. I immediately called Michael, who connected me with Sophia. They can't do this, I insisted. They're celebrating a crime. Actually, Sophia said thoughtfully, this could work in our favor. We were planning to execute search warrants for HOA records next week, but this event might provide a better opportunity. Let me make some calls. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for a tennis court opening. From our kitchen window, I could see people gathering at the courts. Balloons and a refreshment table had been set up. The mayor's car was parked prominently near a ceremonial ribbon stretched across the court entrance. At precisely 9:55 a.m., 4 police cars pulled up, followed by a county vehicle I recognized as Michael's. Officers approached the gathering crowd while Michael and Sophia Martinez walked directly to Margaret Wilson, who was preparing to address the assembled residents. Though I couldn't hear the conversation from our house, the body language told the story. Margaret's face went from confusion to shock to anger. Richard Wilson, standing beside her, began arguing animatedly with Sophia. Meanwhile, Michael addressed the crowd, many of whom looked confused and concerned. Unable to resist any longer, Susan and I walked down to see what was happening up close. Completely ridiculous accusations, Richard Wilson was saying loudly. These tennis courts were properly permitted and built on HOA land. With fraudulent documentation, Sophia replied calmly. We have evidence that the property transfer was forged and the survey falsified. Mayor Anders, looking extremely uncomfortable, tried to slip away from the unfolding drama. Michael intercepted him. Mayor, did you know this facility was built on fraudulently obtained land? Michael asked just as we came within earshot. I was just invited to cut a ribbon, the mayor stammered. I don't get involved in the details of private developments. Margaret spotted us approaching and pointed accusingly. This is all because of them. They're just jealous of our community amenities. They've been harassing us since construction began. Mrs. Wilson, one of the police officers said firmly, we have a warrant to search HOA records related to this property. We also have a cease and desist order preventing any use of these facilities until ownership is legally determined. The officer handed official papers to a stunned Margaret. Another officer began stringing yellow police tape around the perimeter of the tennis courts. A murmur ran through the crowd of residents as they processed what was happening. Some looked shocked, others angry, but the anger seemed increasingly directed at Margaret rather than at us. "You told us everything was legal," one resident shouted at Margaret. "We paid special assessments for these courts. It is legal," Margaret insisted. "This is a witch hunt based on some outdated property records." Richard Wilson pulled his wife aside, whispering urgently in her ear. She shook her head defiantly, but he continued pressing her until she finally fell silent. Michael approached us. "The prosecutor's office is taking this very seriously," he said quietly. "They've assigned 2 investigators just to this case. The evidence of document tampering is overwhelming." "What about our land?" I asked. "And those tennis courts?" "The courts will remain closed until ownership is legally settled," Michael explained. "But given the evidence, I'm confident your property rights will be upheld." The grand opening dissolved into chaos as residents demanded answers from Margaret and the board members present. Susan and I decided to return home rather than add to the tension. As we walked away, I noticed Richard Wilson watching us with a calculating expression that made me uneasy. That uneasiness proved warranted. The next day, a courier delivered a thick envelope containing a lawsuit filed by Richard Wilson against us for defamation, false allegations of criminal conduct, and intentional interference with HOA operations. They were suing us for $500,000. "This is just intimidation," Michael assured us when I called him about the lawsuit. "Classic attorney tactics. When caught doing something wrong, counterattack to distract from your own misconduct." 2 days later, things escalated further. As I was leaving for work, I found a group of angry residents blocking my driveway. They had been told by Margaret that we were trying to destroy their community and force them to lose their investment in the tennis facilities. "Do you know how much our dues increased to pay for those courts?" one woman demanded. "And now they're just sitting there empty because of you." I tried to explain that the HOA had built on our property without permission, but few seemed willing to listen. Margaret had effectively turned them against us by making us the villains. The police had to come to escort me to work. When I returned home that evening, our mailbox had been smashed and someone had spray-painted "property thief" on our garage door. The irony apparently lost on whoever did it. Susan was in tears. "This is getting dangerous, James. All because we want what's rightfully ours." The harassment continued for days. We received anonymous threatening calls. People we'd never even met from Oakwood Estates would drive by our house shouting insults. One night, someone threw eggs at our windows. Then, exactly 9 days after the failed grand opening, everything changed. Early in the morning, multiple police cars arrived at the Wilson residence. From our window, we watched as both Margaret and Richard Wilson were led out in handcuffs and placed in separate police vehicles. Michael called shortly after. "The DA got a judge to approve arrest warrants last night. They're being charged with multiple felonies including forgery, fraud, falsifying government records, and grand theft of real property." "What changed?" I asked. "Why now?" "Someone from inside turned on them," Michael explained. "The county clerk who processed the fraudulent property transfer came forward. He admitted Margaret paid him $5,000 to push the paperwork through without proper verification. He's facing charges too, but getting leniency for cooperating." The news of the Wilsons' arrest spread quickly through Oakwood Estates. By afternoon, the mood had shifted dramatically. Several residents came to our door to apologize for their behavior, explaining they had been misled by Margaret's claims. Frank Thompson, the board member who had visited us earlier, brought a small delegation from the HOA. "We voted to remove Margaret as president," he explained. "And we want to make this right. We had no idea the land wasn't legally acquired. She told us everything was properly purchased and permitted." "The problem remains," I pointed out. "You have tennis courts built on my land without permission." Frank nodded solemnly. "We understand that. The board would like to discuss legitimate options, whether that's purchasing the land properly at fair market value, leasing it, or even removing the courts entirely at our expense and restoring your meadow." It was the first reasonable approach I'd heard since this ordeal began. The criminal case against the Wilsons moved surprisingly quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only had they forged my signature and falsified property records, but investigators discovered they had done similar things with other HOA projects. They had been skimming money from special assessments for years, overcharging for projects and pocketing the difference. 3 months after their arrest, both Margaret and Richard Wilson accepted plea deals rather than face trial. Margaret received 4 years in state prison for her role as the mastermind of the scheme. Richard got 2 years with his law license permanently revoked. They were also ordered to pay substantial restitution. As for our meadow and the tennis courts, we eventually reached an agreement with the new HOA leadership. They would purchase the 1-acre parcel at double its fair market value to compensate for the ordeal they put us through. The money would come from the HOA's insurance policy and from assets recovered from the Wilsons. The story made headlines throughout the county. HOA president and attorney husband jailed for property theft scheme. Michael was featured prominently in the coverage, praised for his role in uncovering the fraud and protecting property rights. His office implemented new verification procedures to prevent similar fraud in the future. 1 year later, I sat with Michael on my back deck, looking out at the tennis courts that now legally belong to Oakwood Estates. Sometimes I miss my meadow, I admitted. The wildflowers, the deer. But the settlement money allowed us to add that sunroom Susan always wanted, and we still have plenty of land left. Michael nodded thoughtfully. What the Wilsons did wasn't just about stealing your land. It was about believing they were above the law, that rules didn't apply to them because of who they were. And if you hadn't been the land registry director? I asked. What would have happened then? Probably nothing good, Michael acknowledged. The system failed initially. Your land was stolen through fraud, and without someone on the inside who could recognize what happened and push for investigation, they might have gotten away with it. The new HOA under Frank Thompson's leadership had become a model of transparency and proper governance. The tennis courts were now officially called Peterson Courts, a small acknowledgement of the land's original ownership. Margaret Wilson was still serving her prison sentence, while Richard had been released to a halfway house after 18 months. Their reputation in the community was destroyed, their assets depleted by legal fees and restitution payments. As for us, we had finally moved past the anger and stress of that terrible time. The harassment had stopped completely once the truth about the Wilson scheme became public. Many residents now greeted us warmly when we walked past the courts, some still embarrassed about how they had treated us during the conflict. You know what still amazes me? I said to Michael as we watched the sunset. Their arrogance. They built an entire tennis complex on someone else's land and expected to get away with it. Michael smiled grimly. People who think the rules don't apply to them never expect consequences. They certainly never expected the owner of the land they stole to have a cousin who directs the land registry office. We clinked our glasses in a small toast to justice, delayed, but ultimately served. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that the Wilsons' biggest mistake wasn't just stealing my land. It was failing to research whose land they were stealing. Had they bothered to learn that Michael Peterson, the county land registry director, was my cousin, perhaps they would have chosen a different parcel to target. Or maybe their arrogance was so complete they wouldn't have cared. Either way, their tennis courts stood as a monument to their downfall, a reminder that sometimes, justice comes from unexpected connections. In the end, the HOA built their tennis courts on my land, but my cousin the land registry director had the final say.